So I am here because lots of my friends have bought sewing machines, which is really exciting, and I have learned so many lovely things in lockdown that I want to share, and I can't because I can't sit with them and show them, and that's really sad. So I'm going to do it by video and yeah, share some stuff. So this is my sewing setup. I get it all out and I put it all away every time I sew because otherwise the children would do all kinds of horrors with it. And this lovely little box I think came from IKEA a long time ago, and I've stolen it for my sewing kit. So I thought I would show you what's in the box and what things you really need to start going with your sewing, particularly with your stretch sewing for your stretchy kids clothes, which is a really good place to start. Right, so at the bottom of my box I have got some tools for putting poppers onto, snap poppers onto baby grows and things like that. These are all plastic ones and I'm not convinced that they're the best option. They're what I've got so far, but I think environmentally and just generally using them, maybe the metal ones are better, but I'm gonna have a look at that, see if I can try a different option. You definitely don't need those to start with, 100% do not need to buy those, so don't worry about them for now. In the middle I've got all my lovely threads. So I've got lots of nice natural neutral colours that I like, and then I've also got lots of dark bright colours in here. My friend with her cream egg thing that's coming soon, cream egg sewing project, might recognise this nice purple thread just for her. And this thread here is a really good one that I'd recommend. It's called Moon Thread and it's cheap. And what's beautiful about it is that if you end up moving on for a sewing machine to an overlocker, which you might do at some point, I have, I couldn't help myself, is that you might find that you can use them on both a sewing machine and you can use them on an overlocker because of the design, the way they pull off the top really easily. So I would really recommend these. They're also cheap and good quality, and you get a lot of thread on there. 1,000 meters or something, so you can wind lots of bobbins up. So if you're doing twin needle top stitching, then you can wind a couple of bobbins up on your machine, and I'll show you how to do that in a separate video, but that's a really good tip for thread. And then in this one I've kind of got, I don't really know what things I don't use very often, like elastic and stuff for when I was making masks, sign of the times. And a few random bits of needles and hemming web I had to go at for making hemming easier. Didn't really find it made it any easier, but worth a try. So again, not another thing that isn't essential, that you don't need. Don't listen to all the adverts. But this here, I don't get this whole box down every time, I just get this little one down. So inside here is all the things I really need. So that's what I'm going to show you in a bit more detail. Right, so on the top, these are the things I use all the time, every day. And I'm going to talk you through the pros and cons of some of them, and the things, again, that you really need and the things that you really don't need to have straight away. So this on the top are some labels. You definitely don't need labels to start with, but there's something that I wanted to add so that I could remember what size the clothes were that I was making, and if I was then to hand them down to somebody, I'd be able to say how big they were, so I thought it was helpful. These ones come printed out on big strips of fabric, and then you cut out the shape that you need. So say I want this label at the bottom, just chop that out. And what's amazing, pretty sure that these cost like pennies each, and oh, it's amazing, so cheap. You can find really expensive ones online. And this is from 42 Custom Fabrics, they're really cheap, and they just sew straight into the seam. Again, I'll show you separately how to do that. But you don't need them, you can just write on the side with your fabric pen what size you're making. That might be a cheaper, quicker alternative to start with, but this is another skill you might want to learn in the future. that's one thing. Obviously, you're going to need a tape measure. I have no idea when I inherited this. It's been with me for a very long time before I even knew what a sewing machine was. And I'm pretty sure you can pick them up in charity shops and stuff for nothing. So it might be worth doing that. But it is essential. It's essential for measuring your children and also for measuring your fabric. Now, these, rather than showing you those first, what I'd like to show you are these. So these are pins, stretch pins, especially for stretch fabric. So they're called ballpoint pins, and they either call them ballpoint or stretch, they all mean the same thing. And the idea is that they don't mark the fabric. And I would say that a couple of quid for a tin of 250 pins or whatever this is better value than these, which once you get on the forums and things, everyone uses sewing clips. You can have them, of course you can have them, but if you're looking for the cheap, quick option to start with, I'd really recommend these. They're a really good option. These are really good if you've got an overlocker because it stops you from munching through your pins and blunting your knife. But if you've got a sewing machine and you're starting out, then you don't need these. They're lovely and they're a great addition in the future, but they're not an essential, so don't worry about them. So these are. Then I've also got a bit of sewing machine oil. You may or may not need to use that. Probably if you've got a nice new machine, you won't need to do that very often. You will need some ballpoint or stretch needles. And this is really important to make sure when you're sewing with your stretch fabrics that the stitches don't skip, which means that you get a lovely row of stitches and every now and then it will miss one and you'll get a really long bit of thread and it'll just look really crap. So you don't want that. So you need some of these. They probably won't come with your machine. You'll probably need to buy these separately. And you might also want to get a twin needle. So twin needles are useful for putting a nice row of stitching around neckbands and hemming like the ends of t-shirt arms or the bottoms of t-shirts. And the beauty of them is they look lovely because they've got a nice row of perfectly aligned double stitching on the top, but also the back of them creates a stretch stitch. So it means that t-shirt necks, for example, will stretch over the head of your child, which is essential really, otherwise you have a shouty child, don't you? You don't want that. So you need to make sure that when you get a twin needle, it's a stretch twin needle. And there are different sizes. I think I probably use the 2.5, I assume that's millimetres, stretch twin needle the most, but I've also got a 4mm stretch needle because you need more than one because they break, because it's easy to make mistakes and break them. So that's a tip. And then I've also got a pair of little nippy scissors for snipping off bits of thread on my sewing machine. Very important. Every time you take the fabric away from your sewing machine, you need to snip the thread off at the end, unless you've got a snazzy machine that does it for you. And a little set of scissors is a really good idea. Whilst we're on scissors, I've also got a different pair that's this shape, so that when you pick them up you just need to squeeze straight away. And actually, I know it sounds ridiculous, but these ones you've got to pick them up and then you've got to find the thumb holes and then you've got to snip. I'd have just bought these straight away if I'd known what they were. I think they cost the same amount. They don't look as pretty, but you just pick them up and instantly you can snip. And you know, when speed is of the essence, because everyone's, it's not when you're sewing, but you know what I mean. You just want to get it snipped, so I'd use one of them. And I've also got a big safety pin for like pulling things through things and all kinds of use. As you never know, you always need to use a safety pin, don't you? So one of those, big solid one of those, and a fabric pencil just to mark out what I'm doing, like what size I need to cut out, if I need to make any markings from the pattern onto the fabric so I know where things are, then this is a really important tool as well. So yeah, and then finally, possibly one of the most important tools is the stitch unpicker, because you're always going to make mistakes and you're always going to need to unpick it. So if you get one of these little bad boys, they're like £1, it'll be like your most used sewing item whilst you're learning what you're doing. Honestly, I used it all the time. I use it so much it's broken. The fact the plastic is broken because I use it all the time. It's very sharp, so be careful. Don't let the kids near it. In fact, don't let the kids near any of this stuff. It's all too sharp. But yeah, it is great. So that is another essential. And then also got some scissors, which you're gonna need for cutting fabric. So they're an essential. You can get beautiful ones, or you can get completely practical ones like these that cut incredibly well. Up to you what you spend your money on, but you do need to spend some money on some decent scissors. I have a feeling these were like £20, which feels like a lot of money for scissors, but they weigh a lot and they're flat at the bottom, so as you snip across it stays flat underneath the fabric. It doesn't lift it up whilst you're trying to cut around a pattern. So that's really important too. Yeah, so the essentials out of all of that are fabric scissors, snips. I mean, they're not essential, I suppose. You could use your fabric scissors for that. Some sort of fabric marker that washes off once you've made your item. A fabric pen if you want to label your clothes once you've made them. Some ballpoint or stretch fabric pins. Ballpoint needles for your sewing machine. Ballpoint twin needles for your sewing machine. Tape measure. And most importantly of all, stitch unpicker. One last option you have for cutting your patterns out, instead of using pins and pinning your pattern to the fabric and cutting out with fabric scissors, which is absolutely an option and I would completely recommend it as the most obvious, cheapest route in to learning how to do these things. The other option you've got is to use a cutting mat and this, which is called a rotary cutter. So you can use this to go around the pattern rather than sitting there and snipping it out. So it is quicker, does take a little bit of practice, but I think generally with kids' clothes that are all full of shapes and curves and things, I find this an easier option, but it is obviously more expensive. You're going to have a mat, I don't know, £20 plus the cutter, I cannot remember, £10. If you've already spent £20 on scissors, you don't need to be spending any money on this at the moment, but further down the line you might want to. The other thing that you might want to do is invest in one of these, which is a quilting ruler, and you see it's see-through and it's marked out on the inches, and also I think the centimetres are marked out as well, but mainly it's the inches. And this is, you'd be amazed how many rectangles you need to cut for kids' clothes. Every time you need to sew on a cuff round the bottom of the legs or a waistband or a neckband, you need to cut a rectangle of ribbing, or you can use jersey, and that's incredibly tedious to do with a marker and a tape measure, but it is doable, and that is a way, you know, you don't need to spend any extra money. Again, this was quite expensive, I think like £16 or something. I would say it's worth the money, but you don't need it. It's not an essential, and it's certainly not when you start out. In fact, I think it's good to learn all these things from a very basic place to start with. So yeah, up to you, but just thought I'd let you know about them. Now, the last thing you'll need, and possibly the most important thing you'll need, are some fabrics. So the pattern that you have, and I'll talk about patterns in a separate video, is going to tell you what type of fabric you can use. And when I first did all of this, it was lockdown. So I've never been into a fabric shop. In fact, I still haven't during all of this. I've been sewing for nearly a year now. Been into a fabric shop to try and test out these fabrics and feel them. And that would be by far the easiest way to know what it is you're trying to buy. And it just feels like a load of funny words that don't really make sense. But what you're looking for to make a basic child's clothing pattern in stretch fabric almost all the time is a thin cotton lycra, which is also called jersey, and you get it in either plain, or you might find it under the tab of striped, or you might find it under the tab of print on different websites. And I find all these fabric websites slightly difficult to navigate until you get a hang of what the fabrics are. But you're looking for jersey, so stretch fabric, jersey, cotton lycra jersey. And I don't know if you can see, but it's got a stretch to it. That's the elastin in it, which, interestingly, probably not very good for the environment. Definitely something we need to think about a bit more. I'm looking at other fabrics that I can use that do the same job. And this means it's got a two-way stretch. So you can see the pattern there. You can see the pattern on the front of the fabric. As you stretch it, you can see little lines. And if you could zoom in really closely on these lines, there are little V shapes. And that's what allows that stretch. But this one, because it's thin, and it'll also say this, it tends to say this when you buy them, has four-way stretch. So it stretches this way and it stretches this way. And it's this stretchiness that gives it the quality that you need for kids' clothes when they're constantly running around and growing and all that sort of stuff. The other thing you'll need for a lot of these patterns is ribbing. And I didn't know what ribbing was. Sounds rude. But once I ordered some, it tends to come, and again, I don't know why, it tends to come in a round tube. See? Tube of fabric. I don't know why, it just does. Maybe that's the way they construct it. And it's slightly thicker than jersey, and it's slightly stretchier. It's not, so if you look at this one, that stretches about that much. This one stretches like, ooh, ooh, it's really stretchy. So it's really good for neck bands if you've got big-headed children like I have. But what you tend to use it on cuffs and neck bands and around the bottom of jumpers and stuff like that. And you also tend to use it folded over. So it makes a kind of thick, cosy edge that sort of hugs itself around the children's legs or arms, around their wrists, and holds everything in place. And that gives you your lovely parsnip pants feel and that sort of look that you want. If, you know, I think once I've cut a pattern where it's asked for exactly the same width as the tube has come in. So I think the bottom of a 5-year-old hoodie happened to be exactly the right width for this, so I just cut across and sewed it straight on. But normally you have to cut up, you know, cut straight up here, so that you've just got one long piece of fabric rather than a tube, and then you can cut whatever size ribbing is required. But again, I'll show you that in a different video. So they're the two main fabrics you need. It's difficult to show them closely, but jersey is almost like, really, I think it's what you get kids' leggings. That kind of, it feels soft and cottony and thin, but stretchy. And then ribbing again is a thin but very stretchy and slightly thicker and warm material for the edging. So those are your two things you need for your basic pattern, and yeah, then you can get cracking. So that's it. That's all the essentials you need. There aren't that many. Don't let the advertisers talk you into more. The only other thing you need really is your pattern and getting online to some good sewing groups where you can share what you're doing, share the things that you're struggling with, and lots of people will help you through, and that's how I've learned all of it. So I will try and put some links to some of those really good groups below the video, and yeah, and then I guess we'll do some more videos looking at starting sewing and some tips for not having an argument with your machine and things like that. And yeah, otherwise the only other essential item I'd say in a sewing kit is one of these. Happy weekend everybody.